In 2015, Uber drivers in Boston were earning over $20 per hour, while traditional taxi drivers and chauffeurs were earning less than $13 per hour. And these differences were similar to the national averages too. This begs the question, were the costs of driving a taxi even worth it then? Across the country, taxi drivers seem to determine it was not.
All right. Well, good evening, and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm Bob Perry, the museum's executive director. It's my pleasure to welcome two distinct audiences to tonight's Mill Talk being delivered by Mr. Dave Broker, our in-person audience here at the museum this evening, and our online audience who will take this all in the future. I thank the Lowell Institute for their generous support of our Mill Talk series. Among the Lowell Institute's many extraordinary contributions to civic life in our region, they've been making grants to support free lectures in Greater Boston since 1839. I've been looking forward to tonight for many reasons, and for one thing, I'm a fan. If you don't already know, Dave Broker hosts an excellent podcast, The Industrial Revolutions. He's published more than 60 episodes or chapters in the nearly 4 years since launching this most ambitious project. I've listened to about a dozen chapters so far, in which I always learn, and I'm happily also entertained. He delivers history lessons with a storyteller's narrative gift and welcome injections of wry humor. I also appreciate how he references related episodes within each episode so that interested listeners immediately know where to go next to learn more about a subject, while also communicating that everything he shares is but an anecdote within a much larger and increasingly cohesive narrative. Dave Broker tells well-researched and well-written stories from various perspectives about scientific breakthroughs, technological advances, economic, cultural, and environmental effects of accelerating change around the world, and of course, stories of the fascinating people, both famous and obscure, who are behind all this progress, and of course, the consequences, which we know aren't always positive. I haven't told anyone this before, but I've realized that I now think of Mr. Broker's podcast as a wonderful contemporary companion piece to our museum. While he certainly doesn't focus on New England, let alone the United States, as we do here in our museum, his global perspective and mine in my regional work are very much in sync. As I often tell our visitors when I share my viewpoint on America's industrial history, the American Revolution created the United States, but the American Industrial Revolution is what made us strong. Well, here are the very first words Dave Broker shared when he launched his podcast on January 7th, 2019. When the Founding Fathers wrote the U.S. Constitution in the 1780s, life on planet Earth had changed very slowly over the previous 10,000 years. Life in 1780 wasn't all that different from life in 1500. Life in 1500 wasn't all that different from life in 1250. Life in 1250 wasn't all that different from life in 1000, and so on and so on. But when the human experience changed completely, but then the human experience changed completely. Where we live, how we live, when we work, when we sleep, how we go about our lives. It's time we told that story. Yes, the industrial revolutions, they transcend cultures and nation states in their transformative impact. They change the world, and Dave Broker is telling that story. We're privileged this evening to be able to be a part of recording a future chapter of the Industrial Revolutions podcast about inevitable cycles of life in industrial evolution and cultural development. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege to welcome the host of the Industrial Revolutions, Dave Broker.
Thank you. All right, so the year was 2013, and I was getting home from work when I first saw one. At that time, I was working in Los Angeles as a young political consultant, I had parked my car down the street and I was walking back toward my apartment building, and just outside, I saw one of my neighbors get into a car with a giant, fluffy pink mustache on the grill. So the year was 2013, and I was just getting home from work when I first saw one. At that time, I was working in Los Angeles as a young political consultant, and I had parked my car down the street, and I was walking back toward my apartment building. Just outside the building, I saw one of my neighbors getting into a car with a giant, pink, fluffy mustache on the grill. Now, I had no idea what I was looking at, but it was certainly a memorable sight. Over the next couple of months, I saw more fluffy pink mustaches on other cars, too. So, out of curiosity, I Googled something like pink mustaches on cars, and I found a YouTube video explaining what it was all about. It had been a guerrilla marketing tactic for a new company called Lyft. And the service this company provided, as explained in the video, immediately captured my attention. It was explained as ride sharing, and the video was recruiting drivers to this revolutionary concept. If you became a Lyft driver, you could pick up a passenger or two on your daily drive into work, earning money from them, which you could use for the car's many needs: lease payments, gas, parking, insurance, you name it. Or you can make a little extra cash on the nights and weekends, driving people to or from the bars, parties, etc. Or you could even become a full-time Lyft driver. Either way, it was in your car and on your time, and anybody could now, essentially, become a taxicab driver. I was so intrigued by this concept that I submitted a web inquiry for more information. I figured I might want to drive Lyft on the weekends, here and there when I had a little extra time, and nothing better to do. And for a while, I was even emailing with a Lyft representative about becoming a driver. In the end, I did not, in part because my job had become time-consuming enough by this point that I really wanted to leave every morsel of it for rest and relaxation when I had the chance. But I did start using Lyft as a customer. And speaking to the drivers on those early trips, I began to take stock of how Lyft, as well as its competitor, Uber, were reshaping human transportation. For one thing, I realized Lyft and Uber rides tended to be a little bit more affordable than a ride in a taxi. This was, at least in part, because the two tech companies were undermining a widespread but disparate taxi licensing system used by local jurisdictions across the country. Used in part to reduce traffic congestion, local governments would award a limited number of medallions to licensed cabs. This had the effect of limiting the supply of rides available to the public, thus keeping fares from getting too low. For another thing, calling for a taxi was inconvenient. In most cities, you needed to call a cab company to send a car, and you'd be waiting quite a while. In fact, earlier that same year, I had waited about 45 minutes for a cab to pick me up at LA's Union Station one day. And at the end of the ride, you were expected to pay in cash. That same ride that took 45 minutes to get to me, it ended up costing me about $70. And I didn't have $70 of cash on me. After all, I remember thinking, who carries that much cash anymore? I was then verbally accosted by the taxi driver when I asked to pay with a credit card. And after scolding me, he retrieved one of those ancient credit card imprinters and manually processed the payment. With Lyft, I could simply take out my phone, open the app, and order a ride. Typically, it would arrive within 10 minutes. A mapping service would then automatically instruct the driver how to most quickly get to my destination. And at the end of the trip, the funds would move from my account to my driver's account. No need for cash, no need for swiping a credit card. Between the lower fares and the greater convenience, The new rideshare apps were massively beneficial to consumers. But for drivers, there were winners and losers. The losers, of course, were the taxicab drivers. To drive a taxicab, one needed to invest in themselves. In 2013, the cost of a taxi medallion in Boston was $500,000. On top of that, a Boston taxi driver had roughly $10,000 worth of expenses each year, including gas, insurance, as well as miscellaneous licensing fees. And rideshare drivers also had to pay for gas and insurance, of course, but not for those miscellaneous fees and not for the medallions. Plus, with surge pricing, they could earn even higher incomes by driving during peak hours. In 2015, Uber drivers in Boston were earning over $20 per hour, while traditional taxi drivers and chauffeurs were earning less than $13 per hour. And these differences were similar to the national averages too. This begs the question, were the costs of driving a taxi even worth it then? Across the country, taxi drivers seem to determine it was not. Within a few years, I remember Lyft and Uber drivers telling me how they used to drive taxis, but had switched over to rideshare services once the taxicab model no longer made financial sense. The winners were the drivers who jumped on the Lyft and Uber bandwagons early. Within a year of using Lyft as a passenger customer, I could recall several rides in luxurious new cars, paid for, I was told, with the income earned from driving for Lyft. In this way, rideshare drivers were able to invest in themselves not by purchasing medallions, but by purchasing new cars that made the rides more enjoyable for themselves and for their passengers. In this way, Lyft and Uber seemed like classic free market success stories. But as students of economics know, the free market often leads to a certain equilibrium, and in time, a new equilibrium was established in the rideshare market. By the end of 2018, I was burned out from more than a decade of working in politics, and I decided to make a career shift. By then, my wife and I were living in Sacramento, and we were planning to move again to Boston, in fact, and I knew that it wouldn't make sense for me to take a local job I wouldn't stay at, so I decided to start the Industrial Revolutions podcast. I knew it would be a while before I was earning money from the podcast, and I wasn't sure exactly how much time I'd need to devote to it each week. So once again, I considered rideshare driving to supplement my income. I was even texting with an Uber recruiter at one point. But I had noticed that my rides in Lyfts and Ubers had changed over the years. The cars I rode in went from spacious new models with spotless interiors, leather seats, and that new car smell, to smaller, older vehicles with cloth upholstery and in need of a good cleaning. Now, exact figures for drivers' compensation over these years is difficult to impossible to calculate, but one 2018 MIT study found that, after expenses, nearly 3 out of 4 rideshare drivers earned less than a minimum wage job would be paying them. And 30% were actually losing money overall. Now, Uber disputed these findings, but that same year, their own in-house economists found that 1 out of 10 of their drivers saw an overall decline in their net income as a result of driving for them. So early success among rideshare drivers had encouraged more and more of them to enter the passenger transportation market. As a result, the number of drivers jumped, bringing the market to that efficient equilibrium. So efficient, in fact, that it brought the wages for such driving to the verge of subsistence level. And in case you need a reminder to your intro to microeconomics, I'm including a generic labor market supply-demand curve here, where the supply of rideshare drivers increases from S1 to S2, driving wages down from W1 to W2. If you're listening to the podcast, this will be in the YouTube video, so you can go watch that. Now, realizing this, I once again decided against becoming a rideshare driver. Coincidentally, though, in my research for the podcast at the time, I soon came across an almost identical story that had played out in England in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was the story of how the so-called putting out system came to dominate the textile trade. Textile spinning and weaving are occupations that predate the written word, and for most people throughout history, they were done in the home or in the local community for personal clothing and other fabric needs. Spinners, or spinsters, would spin rovings of fabric, in England it was usually wool, into yarn, and weavers would weave this yarn into cloths, which could then be used to make clothing or rags or blankets, you name it. In the High Middle Ages, these occupations picked up across Europe as trades. In the year 1155, King Henry II granted a royal charter to the Worshipful Company of Weavers in the city of London. This new guild had a monopoly on weaving in the city, allowing the weavers to command stable prices and, thus, stable incomes for their families. By the late Middle Ages, guilds for spinning and weaving could be found in towns and cities throughout England. The guilds were industry-wide associations, which represented both merchants and artisan craftsmen and controlled their production in seemingly countless trades. There were guilds for textile workers, metal workers, leather workers, tailors, printers, painters, potters, masons, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. No, seriously. You name it. What they controlled was knowledge of the craft. So an example I've offered up on the podcast before is the craft of a goldsmith. So if you wanted to be a goldsmith, you would go through an apprenticeship with a master goldsmith for 7 years of training. This apprenticeship was a period of indentured service, where you would be poorly paid, if paid at all, while you learned the trade. Actually, oftentimes your parents had to pay the master to take you on, since he would be feeding and lodging you. When your apprenticeship was over, you became a journeyman, and as a journeyman, you were a skilled goldsmith, free to practice the trade, and you could make a decent income. After many years as a journeyman, and perhaps after producing a particularly fine piece of gold artistry, a masterpiece, you could become elevated to the status of master goldsmith within your guild. And as a guild master, you could make some good money in the trade, and you'd be responsible for training the next generation of apprentices. But if you did not follow this career path, you were not welcome to produce and sell gold goods within that community. The guilds enjoyed a degree of political influence, which helped them effectively maintain monopolies over their respective trades. If you tried selling gold products, local magistrates could take legal action against you. But as England came out of the Middle Ages, enforcement of the guild's rights and privileges began to wane, especially for those occupations that had lesser political influence. And the occupations most at risk of losing guild control were those in which knowledge of the craft was already pretty widespread. That brings us back to spinning and weaving. By the 18th century, spinning and weaving were skills that many people had, even if they didn't work in the formal trade. Really, this process began with the Black Death of the 1340s and 50s, which created a permanent shift in the primarily agricultural economy of England at the time. Roughly half the population had been killed by the plague, and yet the amount of land remained the same. And so, the gentry decided to convert a lot of their lands into pastures for animal grazing, including sheep grazing. It didn't require as much labor as crop cultivation, after all. This continued even after the population slowly recovered, as landholders enclosed their lands to prevent crop cultivation, preferring the incomes that wool production brought them. By the 1500s, this had created hardship for the peasantry, which needed land to grow food and survive. But other lands fell into disuse and were eventually distributed to yeoman farmers, a new class of landowners who used their property and new lines of credit to build fairly substantial holdings. Between these developments and trade with the wider world, especially after the voyages of Columbus and da Gama, the new system we call capitalism began to emerge. And so, by the 1600s, there was a rural merchant class poised to challenge the urban artisan guilds of old. With the increasing production of wool, many rural English families began to buy or rent the tools needed to create textile goods: spinning wheels, hand looms, and new knitting machines called stocking frames. They didn't need a whole lot of training, since spinning and weaving especially were chores that ordinary folks had been doing since the Stone Age, and the money they earned helped supplement their farming incomes. The burgeoning capitalists of the time created networks of such families to produce textile goods for them. They would buy the wool in bulk and pay these families to spin and weave it. Often, they bought the machines and rented them to the families as well. The families were what we today would call independent contractors. They produced the woolen goods in their own homes and managed their own time. From there, the merchants would take the finished cloths to market and sell for a profit. This domestic, or putting out, system greatly undermined the traditional textile guilds of the towns and cities, which now had to compete with the low prices of the rural cottage industry networks. By the mid-1700s, many guild members were themselves joining these merchant networks. Also by the mid-1700s, the market for textile workers had become oversaturated. In his autobiography, the historian William Hutton recounted his anxieties as a young textile apprentice in 1747, when his master/uncle died. Nobody else would take him on, because they barely had enough work for themselves, much less any to give to an apprentice. Reduced to tears, he realized it was a dying trade, quote, "at which I could not get bread." Fortunately, he then switched to bookbinding and built a very successful career around books. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with rideshare driving? Well, first of all, these are skills that are already widely held or easy to learn, or both. For pre-industrial textile workers, this was because spinning and weaving were necessary chores for clothing your family. Stock framing was easy enough to learn as well. Of course, nowadays, very few of us know how to do these tasks, but none of those textile workers knew how to drive a car, did they? Now, how many people in this room do know how to drive a car? Show of hands. Yeah, that's what I thought. Which leads me to today's passenger drivers. The skills of driving a motor vehicle is one learned by just about everyone in the modern world. Of course, in the old days, these industries were covered by certain local protections that economists call barriers to market entry. For textile workers, going back to the Middle Ages, these had been the monopolies of the guild system. Royal charters gave the guilds legal status, and apprenticeships allowed the guilds to control knowledge of the craft. Thus, many workers, or their parents anyway, had to pay for inclusion in the guild system, in which they would be economically protected by the force of law. For passenger drivers up until 2013 or so, these had been the taxi medallions, given out by local governments to control congestion. While they didn't usually create literal monopolies, they effectively limited the labor supply to those who could afford to purchase a medallion. Then, these trades see the introduction of independent contractors. In 17th and 18th century England, these were the rural families that joined the networks of textile merchants employing the putting out system. They spun, weaved, and knitted on their own time in their own homes. In 21st century America, these were what Uber calls the partner drivers of the two tech companies. They drove passengers around on their own time in their own cars. As a result of this process, the new independent contractors prove difficult to regulate within the old order of things. The state is either unable or unwilling to extend barriers to market entry. Thus, such protections are gradually corroded over time. Although, if we're being completely honest, in the case of taxi drivers, these protections were basically smashed to smithereens and very quickly. Now, because these are jobs in which the skills needed to do them are already pretty widely held, workers rush into the market to fill these positions. What better way to make a little extra cash than doing something you're already familiar with? But because so many people have entered this labor market, it plunges toward a ruthlessly efficient equilibrium. The price they can fetch for their labor falls to the point where they can barely feed themselves within the market. But the comparisons don't end there. In both cases, the new glut of workers that have swelled in their respective markets are suddenly crushed by new technologies. In 1733, a 29-year-old tradesman named John Kay received a patent for a wheeled shuttle that weavers could put in their hand looms. This device, the fly shuttle or flying shuttle, doubled the efficiency of weaving. And to make a wide batch of cloths, you'd only need about 1 out of every 4 weavers you'd used to need. It wasn't long before the weavers were feeling the pinch of displacement as a result of this new efficiency. According to legend, a mob of local weavers in Kay's hometown attacked his house in 1753, and he was only able to escape because his friends smuggled him out in a sack of wool. In the 1760s, a weaver named James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny. Still using a spinning wheel, the contraption added several spindles, eventually 24 in all, which made the spinning of yarn significantly more efficient. Within 20 years, there were about 20,000 spinning jennies across Britain. Hargreaves, too, had to flee his hometown to escape angry local spinsters. In 1768, a wig maker named Richard Arkwright produced a new spinning frame, which further increased the efficiency of spinning yarn, especially when he set up a water mill to power it. In 1779, a former spinner named Samuel Crompton combined the concepts of the spinning jenny and the Arkwright water frame to create a crossover device, or mule. This spinning mule could spin 200 and eventually 1,300 spindles at one time. And in 1785, the clergyman Edmund Cartwright invented the power loom. Powered by water and later by steam engines, power looms were automated weaving machines that were twice as fast as hand loom weavers. And as the years went on, such technologies only continued to improve. One 2012 study estimated that by the end of the 19th century, weaving had become 50 times as efficient as it was in the days of the hand looms. Spinning, meanwhile, became 370 times as efficient over the course of just 70 years. And with these efficiencies, the skills of traditional spinners and weavers became obsolete. The craft was now mechanized, and the already oversaturated labor market for these spinners and weavers was rapidly wiped out. Within a few decades, they could no longer find employment thanks to the new technologies. While it hasn't happened yet, there is a new technology out there which similarly threatens the work of taxi and rideshare drivers: the autonomous vehicle. Self-driving cars are already being tested around the world. In the last 7 years, major advancements have been made, as both the tech and auto industries have invested billions of dollars in R&D. Such vehicles have now been tested at millions of miles. In 2004, DARPA held its first grand challenge for driverless cars. The best any of these cars could do was drive about 7 miles in the empty desert of California. But by 2016, self-driving cars were already performing taxi services for live passengers in Singapore. Big data, collected through numerous sources, including from car companies themselves, most notably Tesla, and sophisticated algorithms have allowed driverless cars to become possible. And yet, I find people are awfully dismissive of these advancements. News stories about autonomous car failures seem to give folks the impression that the technology is quite far from ready, if it'll ever be ready. There have been accidents and even casualties in testing in recent years, but make no mistake, these problems are going to be overcome. For example, problems like changing seasons once confounded the engineers of driverless cars. Snow created a massive challenge for these vehicles' computers. But through testing, cloud-based data storage, and AI, the problem is no more. Major changes in the car's environment, be it the time of day, or weather conditions, or road construction, or even an empty plastic bag flying through the air past the front of the car, are obstacles that have now largely been accounted for. With AI, cars are not only learning traffic patterns, environmental changes, and other situational data, but also how human drivers react to such data already. Do they hit the brake, speed up, move the steering wheel? Sensors on existing vehicles allow this data to be collected and studied by the AI programs for the future. These are the same sensors that will alert you if you're changing lanes with another car in your blind spot, or tell you to brake if there's an obstacle in front of you, or behind you if you're backing up. Already, these functions are assisting drivers of newer cars, keeping them in their lanes, braking for them, which actually makes modern cruise control really nice, and, as you've probably seen in TV commercials, parallel parking for them. In other words, certain functions of driverless driving are already in operation in our vehicles. Of course, there can, and will, always be circumstances so unusual that the car's computer won't be properly prepared. But the same thing can be said of human drivers, too. People make mistakes and crash their cars all the time. The key to the driverless car is it needs to reach a certain level of performance and safety acceptability, which we, as a society, can agree upon. In fact, there is good reason to believe that, in time, driverless cars will be considerably safer than human-driven cars, as they won't be at the mercy of human error. As the 19th century Scottish engineer and inventor James Naismith once said of his machines, they, quote, never got drunk, their hands never shook from excess, they were never absent from work, they did not strike for wages, they were unfailing in their accuracy and regularity, end quote. Well, the computer system of an autonomous vehicle won't get sleepy on the road, it won't drink and drive, it won't get distracted by text messages, And it won't forget how to drive in snow after the first snowfall every year, the way human drivers always seem to. Now, it is true that driverless cars are not, right now in 2022, ready for mass distribution. But I see little reason to believe that they won't be available within the next 20 years, if not by the end of this decade. Already, this technology has been applied to agricultural equipment, as well as robots for warehouses, offices, big box stores, hospitals, and more. The biggest bottleneck for cars is in data collection. For driverless driving to be safe, a lot of data need to be collected for the AI programs. But as the efficiencies of data collection and machine learning continue to improve, the horizon for this adoption, of this technology's adoption, moves closer and closer at an accelerating pace. And in the meantime, the vehicles can be used in settings where there is a lower risk of surprising circumstances. Fans of The Simpsons will recall an episode many years ago when Homer discovers a conspiracy among semi-truck drivers. The trucks they were driving were actually doing most of the driving for them. Well, this arrangement is already upon us. In 2016, an autonomous semi-truck transported over 50,000 cans of beer, approximately 100 miles through Colorado, only needing a human to take over when it entered the more unpredictable scenarios of traffic within city limits. And so, the autonomous vehicle threatens the livelihoods not only of taxi and rideshare drivers, but also of truckers, bus drivers, delivery drivers, couriers, and heavy equipment operators. Now that we're a quarter millennium into industrial revolutions, we seldom stop to ask why we even put up with it, why we tolerate changes that threaten so many jobs. We almost accept it as a fact of life. But couldn't we just ban such technology? Well, frankly, it's not clear we could. When William Lee invented the stocking frame in 1589, Queen Elizabeth I tried killing it, telling him, quote, "Consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars." End quote. Nevertheless, these rudimentary machines slowly spread. But even if we could prohibit such inventions, we still have good reason not to. Since we first began experiencing rapid economic growth over 200 years ago, we have come to expect it to continue, as if it were a birthright. If our gross domestic product, GDP, does not expand, it means we will not be able to as easily redistribute funds, meaning we will have fewer resources available for healthcare, education, etc. If we do not grow our economy, we run the risk of other countries overpowering us in industrial development and military prowess, making us vulnerable to attack. Politicians are incentivized to focus on economic growth, knowing that if the economy fails to grow at a sufficient rate, especially if it fails to grow faster than inflation, voters will become angry and choose different politicians come election time. And even in non-democratic countries, politicians seek economic growth as a means to ward off revolt and revolution. In order to grow an economy, there's a few different things we can do. We can add to the supply of fixed capital within the economy, that is, build new factories, buy more machines, etc. Or we can expand the supply of labor by hiring more workers or by extending their hours, or both. Or we can increase the number of workers and the amount of fixed capital for them to work with. But ultimately, there are limits to the growth these strategies can achieve. Whether growing the stock of capital or the stock of labor, there is a law of diminishing returns. Take, for example, increasing the labor stock. There are only so many hours in a day that somebody can work. There are only so many individuals looking for work. And if we're being completely honest, not all workers will be able to add to the overall output equally. As any manager knows, some employees are simply better for the task at hand than others. The more labor you add, the less output per worker or per work hour you will achieve. Therefore, there is a point at which you cannot continue achieving economic growth. Unless, that is, you can change the curve. This is sometimes referred to as a technology shock, a moment in which a new technology comes along, suddenly allowing capitalists and workers to rapidly increase the scale of output. We saw this with the adoption of the power loom, for example, which greatly increased the productivity of weaving. 10 workers could produce many more cloths managing a series of power looms than they could have produced as handloom weavers. Theoretically, the driverless car will make many more passenger trips possible than are possible today, thanks to the limited number of available Lyft and Uber drivers. But this is an oversimplification. For one thing, it doesn't need to be a technological development. You can change this curve with anything that increases what economists call total factor productivity, or TFP. So, let's say you're in charge of a team unloading a truck, right? At first, the workers are each taking packages off the truck individually. Each one climbs into the truck bed, grabs a package, carries it off the truck bed, walks it to its new location, sets it down, walks back to the truck, repeats the process. And then you suddenly come up with an idea. You have one worker on the truck picking up the packages. He hands each package off to another worker standing next to him, who turns and hands it to a worker standing below the truck, and that worker hands it off again to a rotating series of workers who run the packages to their new positions. They each hand it off to a fifth worker who sets it down. In this way, you are incorporating the concept of division of labor as described by Adam Smith in his famous 1776 treatise on the Wealth of Nations. You are also incorporating something of an assembly line process, as made famous by such industrialists as, Henry Ford at his Model T plant in the early 20th century. Both concepts are good examples of how you can increase TFP without necessarily needing a new kind of technology. What's more, new technologies don't necessarily increase TFP. There are plenty of cool inventions that don't make us more productive. Who here has opened their smartphone to do something productive, wound up opening a social media app instead, and found themselves watching videos for a half hour? I know I have. But generally speaking, the incredible economic growth our planet has experienced over the previous 250 years is thanks to new technologies, like John K's flying shuttle, the steam engine, running water, and so many others that are impossible to count or list for you today. So if you want more examples, there's this podcast you should check out called The Industrial Revolutions. And yet, not all of these technological breakthroughs look the same in terms of their economic impact. Obviously, some increase TFP more than others. But also, some create much broader economic benefit than others. Even if you look at two technologies which increase GDP by the exact same dollar amount, who stands to gain from each technology might vary widely. Consider this. A couple centuries ago, a typical adult woman had a significant workload despite not being part of a formal workforce. Hours were spent every day gathering water, tending the household fire, cooking meals from scratch, and completing a rotating series of chores from washing clothes, sewing, sweeping, and beating out rugs, to making candles, making soap, shopping, and more. In the years since, we have seen a myriad of new technologies and other goods that have increased domestic TFP, running water, indoor heating, electric lighting, appliances like refrigerators, gas ovens and stoves, microwave ovens, washing machines, dryers, dishwashers, sewing machines, vacuum cleaners, and mass-produced and mass-distributed goods like canned foods, cleaning agents, and more. As a result, household chores can now be done much more efficiently. This freed up women's domestic labor time, allowing them to enter the labor market and take new income-generating jobs. This in turn created a big expansion of GDP, much of which was captured by the women themselves, who took it home with them in the form of paychecks. Some of these are known as general-purpose technologies. They are the breakthroughs which tend to be the most world-changing. A general-purpose technology, or GPT, are those that have broad applications across the economy. Not only do they increase total factor productivity, they also often allow for new inventions in turn. The steam engine was a great example. It allowed for big advancements in transportation and factory power. Another is the adoption of electrical engineering, which has given us light bulbs, motorized appliances, and more. All of which allowed us to further expand production and distribution of goods and services. Still another is the computer, which has rapidly increased our business management productivity, allowed us to adopt automation in manufacturing, and even allowed screwballs like me to make money podcasting. Of course, a particularly important GPT for our story is the internal combustion engine. Without it, we wouldn't be talking about taxi drivers or rideshare drivers or driverless cars. And the internal combustion engine is a good example of what we might call a labor-enhancing technology. So too are the domestic breakthroughs that helped women enter the labor force. These are the inventions, which help workers become more productive, benefiting the forces of labor and capital alike. Cars and trucks ultimately helped create new jobs and good-paying jobs, while allowing a previously impossible scale and scope of travel and commercial distribution to take root across the world. Other technologies might expand GDP, but the gains will mostly go to the investors who delivered the capital to implement them. These we can call labor-replacing technologies. There are countless examples of this. In 1930, there were some 235 telephone switchboard operators in the United States. Then, the telephone companies began introducing new technologies, which allowed their customers to dial exact numbers, reaching other customers directly. As a result, there are fewer than 5,000 such telephone operators employed today. There used to be tens of thousands of motion picture projectionists employed across the country. These were high-skilled jobs that paid well and often came with union representation. But the digitalization of film since the 1980s has obliterated the profession. Today, there are only about 1,600 projectionists nationally, most of whom work at niche cinemas on a part-time basis. But manufacturing jobs have been by far the hardest hit. The automation of assembly lines has eliminated more than 250,000 American jobs since the start of this century. Most of the workers made redundant by this transition have not found comparable jobs elsewhere. Those who chose to stay in the labor market either had to invest in new education for themselves to learn new skills, or they've had to settle for lower-paying jobs, typically in the service sector. Often, these jobs pay such low wages that the worker must find several of them to support herself and her family. This is a phenomenon which Joseph Schumpeter described as creative destruction. Though little noticed in his time, Schumpeter is now one of history's most influential economic thinkers for his understanding and articulation of total factor productivity. He described the process of creative destruction as one that, quote, continuously revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one." End quote. Once stable professions must be replaced as new, more productive methods are conceived. Of course, the goods that our manufacturing workers once produced are still being produced, only now by robots. This is a trend that has been ongoing for about 50 years. Yes, production has increased, and so the economy has expanded. But the gains made have almost entirely gone to those who invested the capital. So while TFP has more than doubled, real wages have somewhat stagnated. This is especially evident when you break it down by income level. The majority of Americans have seen modest economic growth, while those at the top have seen their incomes soar. This is especially striking when you look within the top 10% of income earners. You see most of their gains are going to the top 1%, and even within the top 1%, most gains are going to the top 0.1%. Of course, while growing income inequality is a concern, none of these data alone suggest there is an overwhelming reason to worry. But when we add economic stressors to the equation, like wars, or famines, or pandemics, then yeah, there's plenty of reason to worry. Tonight, we are here inside the Francis Cabot Lowell mill. It was on this site where the American industrialist Francis Cabot Lowell established his Boston Manufacturing Company in 1813. Just a few years earlier, he had traveled with his family to the UK. They settled there for a number of years, ostensibly for a long vacation, though it seems maybe Lowell had more business to mix in with pleasure than he was telling people. He visited a number of factories during his time there, and by the end of 1811, he was writing home about the incredible productivity of the cotton mills. British textiles might have started with wool, but by this point, cotton was king. In these mills, Lowell saw and learned the process flows, mechanical details, and other secrets of the cotton trade. With the War of 1812 on the horizon, he left the UK and returned to Massachusetts. At this site in Waltham, he bought a vacant paper mill and converted it into a factory for the production of cotton goods. He employed one Paul Moody to help build the machines, and he started hiring workers. In particular, Lowell recruited young women from New England farming families. He figured these women would be willing to work away from home for a few years to make a little extra cash for a dowry, to train to become teachers, or to help out with their families. They would get excellent, clean housing in the boarding village. Their hours would be long, but the work wouldn't be too physically demanding, and it would pay better than other opportunities. And as it turns out, many of the women loved the arrangement. The work was easier, the village was cleaner, and their lives were more social than the more back-breaking, dirty, and isolated experiences they would have on the farms. And, being in their late teens and early 20s, many of these young women no doubt appreciated the opportunity to get away from overbearing parents. Now, to be sure, this was a rather progressive vision Lowell had for the mill and for the workers' accommodations. And unfortunately, neither he nor his vision would survive the expansion to the city that now bears his name. There would be plenty of labor unrest in the history of Lowell, Massachusetts. But Mr. Lowell very much wished to avoid a recreation of the conditions he saw in the mills in Britain. There he had witnessed tired, sick workers, many of them children, living and laboring in degrading conditions. And he was convinced that this was a tinderbox for social upheaval. After all, it was during his years in Britain that such a tinderbox exploded there. On the night of March 11th, 1811, a prominent mill in Arnold, Nottinghamshire, was attacked by a clandestine group of handloom weavers. In just hours, they destroyed 63 machines, and over the next 3 weeks, they attacked more mills and some 200 stocking frames. These were not random break-ins or acts of vandalism. That month, mill owners and local newspapers began receiving letters from a mysterious General Ned Ludd and his army of redressers. And so the newspapers dubbed these attackers Luddites. The Luddites were an incredibly secretive, organized, disciplined, and militant movement across northern England. Most of the men were in their early to mid-20s. They conducted elaborate, secret ceremonies, carried out drills in the woods, carried a wide array of weapons, and taught themselves how to rapidly dismantle and destroy the machines they blamed for their underemployment. They invented a form of sign language and memorized cues, disguised themselves with dark clothing, coal dust, and scarves, and even women's clothing. And they wrote songs and poems extolling the virtues of their cause. The Luddites used intimidation as much as they did violence. They would plaster strongly worded posters on the doors of textile factories. Before attacking a mill, they would usually notify the victim or the local press ahead of time to give the owner the opportunity to reform his business first. Now, the demands varied. Often, they insisted the owners abandon power looms and bring back hand looms. But sometimes they merely wanted the advance of power looms to slow down, or for a system of profit sharing to be introduced. In 1813, thousands of Luddites participated in attacks on mills. They tore down iron gates and smashed windows to get in. They destroyed hundreds of stocking frames, spinning jennies, and power looms. They also entered and destroyed the homes of mill owners. And before it was over, they were carrying out assassinations of mill owners too. Mill owners responded by installing new security systems and hiring armed guards. Parliament passed new laws prescribing the death penalty for those who destroyed textile machines or made oaths to secret organizations. At least 12,000 troops were sent to northern England to quell the uprising. Literal shooting battles broke out between the Luddites and the armed forces of the mill owners and of the state. The authorities rounded up suspected Luddites and tortured them to extract information. By 1813, the Luddite attacks died down, but even this was not the end of labor unrest in England during that decade. Now, to be sure, there have been plenty of similar stories involving workers responding to the threat of technological unemployment this way. German boatmen on the river Vessen destroyed what was likely the first ever successful steamboat way back in 1707. Parisian tailors burned down one industrialist's sewing machine factory in 1831, and a few years later when he rebuilt it. When the first oil pipelines were built in Pennsylvania and Azerbaijan in the 1860s, armed guards were needed in both places to prevent local transport workers from attacking the pipelines and destroying the petroleum being moved. But the troubles in England were worse, in part because they were compounded by other issues. The Napoleonic Wars required resources being redirected to the armies on the continent at the same time that British exports were cut off from that continental market. So as a result, the prices of everyday goods like food and soap and coal went up, while the wages textile workers could command fell. A generation later, a similar development was seen across continental Europe, as industrialization began taking off there, too. A series of bad harvests led to inflation, which led to a financial crisis, which led to mass unemployment, which led to revolutions in France, Germany, Italy, and several other countries in 1848 and 49. But today, this feels like ancient history. I mean, have you ever read about bank tellers smashing ATMs? Has Google had to hire armed guards to protect its headquarters from torch-wielding reference librarians? No. Clearly, there has been a paradigm shift. Partially, this is because the Second Industrial Revolution, approximately 1870 to 1914, depending on who you ask, saw the introduction of many labor-enhancing technologies. These created new opportunities for the working class to rise in prosperity and, thus, improved the way workers viewed new inventions. Also, by the mid-20th century, governments across the Western world, Social Democrats in Europe and New Deal Democrats in the United States, advanced economic policies that demanded greater redistribution of the wealth being generated by increases in total factor productivity. As a result, scholars, policymakers, and even most citizens began to dismiss anyone with concerns about technological unemployment. Many economists even describe their fears as the quote-unquote Luddite fallacy. I distinctly remember this dramatized in the 2005 film Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where Charlie's father loses his assembly line job to a robot. But in the end, he becomes a robot repairman, so it was all fine. But perhaps the technological trends of 1870 through about 1970 have given us a false sense of security. Not all of those assembly line workers can become robot repairmen, after all. As old jobs become obsolete with new methods of productivity, new jobs also need to be created to absorb the excesses in the labor supply. Otherwise, there will be more unemployment and underemployment, more individuals and families experiencing poverty, and more cases of civil unrest. In fact, this was a big reason for the poverty seen in England during the early 19th century, as industrialization was just taking off. Advancements made in agriculture a century earlier had drastically reduced the need for field labor. This led many workers in rural England to the brink of starvation, and as they moved into industrializing cities looking for work, there just weren't enough jobs for them all yet. This is why we have such a Dickensian memory of the first industrial revolution. The British labor market didn't even out until the 1850s or so. And today, many of the jobs being created to absorb those workers displaced by factory automation just don't pay as well. And many have left the formal labor market for the informal and black markets. To bring it back to The Simpsons, essayist Danny Alexis Riskamp noted in a 2020 article for The Atlantic that the cartoon family's life today simply would not be possible. With a blue-collar job and a union and a high school education, Homer is able to support a family of 5 in a large suburban house with 2 cars in the garage and vacations to far-off destinations. That just doesn't happen anymore. It's no wonder, then, why the phrase, "Make America Great Again," resonated with so many. In his recent book, The Technology Trap, Oxford economist Carl Benedict Frey suggests that the election of Donald Trump amounted to a 21st century version of Luddism. In that sense, the January 6th attack on the Capitol building looks not all that unlike the 1811 and 1812 attacks on the textile mills of northern England. And looking into the not-so-distant future, we see many more jobs at risk. Over the next 20 years, we can reasonably expect AI to replace workers in industries that go far beyond motor vehicle driving. There are already technologies that could soon replace the majority of airline pilots, fast food workers, casino dealers, insurance underwriters, tax preparers, poets, musicians, and more. Soon, we may not need photographers to take photographs. Many of us dog lovers in Boston follow the Pied Dog Walker on Instagram. A few months ago, he posted this on his feed. He had typed out a series of words into an AI program, probably something like, "For St. Bernard's, line, tongues out." And it generated several photos for him. Okay, clearly the technology is not quite ready yet, but these images are remarkably close to the ones he already regularly posts. As he put it here, quote, "Give it a few more years, and I won't be able to compete." Here's one I created at deepai.org, typing in podcaster, microphone, smile. It took me literally 5 seconds. Computer software programmed with statutes and case law precedents would likely weigh legal arguments much more objectively than human judges do. With DNA analyses and other tests, computer programs will soon be able to diagnose patients more accurately than human physicians do. AI and cloud-based storage could easily displace most government clerks and their arcane filing systems. And between you and me, my day job organizing historical walking tours in Boston could very, very easily be replaced by a computer program. Don't tell my boss. And I can certainly imagine a future in which AI can produce episodes of the Industrial Revolutions without me doing much more than typing in a few keywords. The scope of jobs at risk is much wider than at any previous time in history. This isn't to say all these jobs will be replaced, but most of them could. And it's not clear what kind of new jobs could be created or how many new jobs would need to be created to absorb all these people displaced within the labor market. This is the primary reason why so many folks today are talking about a possible universal basic income. Now, add stressors on top of all these trends. As I speak, we are facing a brutal and precarious worldwide economic recovery following a great pandemic, a war in Ukraine that is disrupting critical global energy supplies, and a climate crisis causing famines and natural disasters, driving waves of refugees into countries that can barely figure out how to raise their own people's wages. And there's little reason to believe stressors like these will ease up anytime soon. The point is, we are in much more dangerous territory today than I think the average person realizes. And this is a big reason why I started a podcast about the Industrial Revolutions. It's a history podcast for the future, because we need to prepare for a world in which so many of us are made redundant. Of course, no historical trend lasts forever, but creative destruction could very easily define the remainder of our lifetimes. And so, the question I want to leave you with tonight is this: what are we going to do about it? I don't pretend to know the answer, but I also know we can't afford to keep ignoring the question. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, we can do a little Q&A.
So do you actually have any opinion on universal basic income?
Yeah.
So do you have a positive or negative opinion on the idea of a universal basic income?
You know, it's funny because it's one of those things where, coming from a social science background, you'd love it if you could get some sort of example of it first, some sort of, I guess you kind of do with Alaska, but you would want some sort of test case. And it's a little difficult to do a test case in a location, right? We think of this too. Single-payer healthcare is, I think, a great example of this, how in theory, maybe it would work, but, you know, it was tried in Vermont. And I remember thinking as they were trying it there, I was like, that's not where you try it. It's too small. You need a big market, and you really need everybody on the same page throughout a single economy. And we have just too interconnected economy in the United States, I think, to try programs like this on local levels. So my answer is maybe. It's kind of hard to know exactly if what it would do. There's definitely drawbacks to it. You want people incentivized to work, not only for the sake of, I don't know, productivity, but also for the sake of people's quality of life. There's plenty of research out there that suggests that people do find more personal sense of fulfillment when they go to a job and do a hard day's work, and it's accomplishment. They've earned their pay versus what they could just get on the government dole, so to speak. So there is I think a legitimate case to be made against it in that sense, but then you come back to, well, how do you fairly redistribute the gains of total factor productivity if so much of it is going into, if so much of it is generated by labor replacing technologies? I don't know.
I just wanted to mention, perhaps you're already familiar, that universal income is being tested in this country in a variety of metro areas with certain populations that are thought to be historically disadvantaged. And it was looked at from many different vantage points, not only economically, but gender, all manner of issues. Combined with the notion of having some kind of floor and ceiling for housing so that there would be some way for people to not be homeless, but neither could you profit as much off of housing investment as is currently available. So some kind of mix of these things with a possible return to more craft industry. So people have the sense of being productive, having human connection, things to do that give meaning to their time with less economic pressure for basic survival.
Yeah. It was, when we were living in Northern California, there was a pilot program in, Stockton, California, is that the name of the city? And if I remember correctly, it kind of blew up in their faces a little bit. Or at least it did in with the case of the mayor who introduced it. He ended up getting voted out the next election. But I mean, the other issue with giving people crafts, giving people the ability to focus on other things, be it art or music or learning or whatever they want to do, all of that is it's stuff that they can do, and that's great. And the other hand, they won't really be able to deliver that into a market where they can compete with the AI still is kind of the issue. I mean, there are programs that already that have been invented that can write, like I said, like poets and musicians are at risk, that can not only compose symphonies that sound like anything like a great composer of human history could have done, but write haikus that are indistinguishable from haikus that human poets could write, and they can do it at such a quantity, it's unbelievable. I mean, there would be no way to keep up with all the new art and music coming out in this respect. So yeah, it's one of those things where I could see it as people sort of, you see, with our current social media landscape and our politics, how you could imagine a scenario in which people are fighting for, it's like, no, it's like, buy human, don't buy robot, buy human, like we said, like buy American 50 years ago when we were first starting to outsource. I could see that, yeah.
Well, you see so many things now, made by hand, or somehow it's been touched by human hands. I see this even in butcher shops where, a human cut this. It wasn't just machine.
Yeah. One of my good friends from high school, actually, she was my first interview for the podcast. She's a traditional handloom weaver. She works in Virginia, and I still follow her on Instagram. She does these great videos that show her process, and so you can certainly, especially with the modern social media we have, there are definitely ways you can not only do that and make a career out of it, but in a very new way that captures people's attention. I don't know. I guess with deep fakes, you could conceivably fake that, but. Yeah, we'll see. Well, I think we also have to see what exactly happens with our with our laws going forward too. I don't know if Congress, for example, will allow some of the advancements we're seeing. It's possible they'll try to tamp it down in the years to come. Who knows?
Thanks. Hi, Dave. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Good. A little bit of a departure on topic. The pandemic has shaken up our relationship with work in the office, for many people at least, depending on what you were doing before and during the pandemic. And I think it's still, my impression is it's still reverberating now as people figure out where one wants to work, how workplaces are organized, whether people want to work as much or whatever. And I wanted to ask if you have a historical perspective on that at all, or an analogy or a perspective to offer. I hear the news talk about it in present terms, but I think your perspective would be good.
Yeah, it's still really unclear how everything is shaking out. When we were first all sent home, we all thought it would pass. I didn't bother thinking about it too much, but within a few months of being stuck at home, I at some point decided I'm going to do a special episode about the history of pandemics and the effect they've had economically. And it's a mixed bag, in part because different pandemics play out differently. But I don't really know, because this is so new. There hasn't been a time in history where you could do work remotely, the way you can now. You can't, you wouldn't have been able to have meetings remotely like you can now. You wouldn't be able to transmit certainly before the electric telegraph, you wouldn't be able to have transmitted information as rapidly as you can now. So we'll see. But I do think that at the very least there have been, it was a bit of a hitting the brakes, if you will, on our pretty fast-paced, neoliberal era economic workflow and the grind, if you will, and people slowed down and they suddenly took stock of all this in a way they didn't before. Right now, one thing I have noticed is a lot of people are talking about quiet quitting, I think they're calling it, right? Where people just aren't working as hard because they're choosing not to unless they get paid more. And that is not a new concept. That I can point to from the first industrial revolution in Britain in the years leading up to and following the Luddite attacks. The English called it the lump o' labor, and it was basically this concept where you only work as hard as you need to. And if you see a way to improve productivity in the mill, don't tell the boss. Just keep it to yourself. So, yeah, it's not a. There is some historical precedent for what we're seeing now, but I think that at the end of the day, with the way the modern economy, especially a global economy, works, where everything is so interconnected, and one thing triggers another thing. We just, inflation. We pumped so much money into the economy to keep it from entirely collapsing into some sort of medieval dystopia, that now we're seeing inflation. Okay, well, inflation continues, we might see a worldwide recession. Okay, well, that might change people's thoughts about how they're going to contribute in terms of work moving forward, how they prioritize work-life balance and so forth. Because if you're struggling, you might change your calculus a bit more. We'll see.
A contribution I'd make to this conversation is maybe we replace the word. Basically, I'm thinking about disruptions. Okay, so replace pandemic with World War, and what happened in World War II? Well, a lot of the male workforce was extracted from their traditional, let's say factory jobs, and they were replaced by women. And after World War II ended, did it automatically just immediately revert to the before times? It didn't. And a lot of women maybe stopped working to get married and start families, but an effective female workforce was a thing from that point forward. And that's a similar disruption to a pandemic where the fundamental rules of the game were changed. Another thing I would offer up is all of these waves of changes, all of these industrial revolutions are driven mostly by, the surprise advance here and there, but also profit motive. And what is rarely factored in is what we have at our discretion, which is, two words come to mind immediately that I think a lot about, and that's empathy and compassion. And a lot of the choices that are made by the money, a lot of the choices that are made by the technological advance do not factor in their effects on people and the world and so forth. And that's where good governance can be a constraint on let's say hurting people, but can we we find ourselves in the United States very dependent on the generosity of an individual who just suddenly spasms and says, I'm going to do good in the world. And if you don't have a person like Bill Gates say, I want to use much of my wealth to wipe out malaria, it isn't going to happen. So it comes down to one person sometimes. And that's what I despair of. So a lot of the changes that we have seen that cause great harm to a great many people, but society as a whole, GDP rises, total productivity rises. There's a tremendous amount of pain that's borne by a great many people as a consequence of this quote unquote progress. And I don't have a suggestion of how to deal with that going forward, but I'd love to see a bit more empathy and a bit more compassion, and it may be necessary. I mean, that's where universal basic income comes from. It puts a floor beneath people, and there are some people that just can't make it without help. And systemically, I think we need that.
Yeah. It's a few thoughts on that. There's a growing trend I've seen to suggest that billionaires shouldn't exist. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think billionaires are uniquely able to move large amounts of capital for innovative things that increase productivity and ultimately growth that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do without them. especially with their being more flexible than, say, a government agency. However, I also think I think it was Balzac who said, at the root of every fortune lies a crime. And so you need to, you need some way to adjust this dynamic. Those slides I showed with the diverging income levels, the reason this is precarious is because, all right, GDP equals what? It equals consumer spending plus savings / investment plus government spending plus net exports. So the big two for this purpose are investment and consumer spending. If you have widening income gap, if you have this huge income gap growing, then most of that GDP is concentrated not in consumer spending, but in investment. Because an individual, okay, you can only buy so many yachts, you can only buy so many houses, and so forth. A lot of it just gets invested into new capital, new real estate, whatever, and so much of that is tied up in financial markets, which are inherently riskier than, giving people money to go spend at, on Amazon to buy whatever stuff they need around the house, right? So, yeah, it gets scarier the wider that gap gets. And then, like I said, you add stress, you call them disruptors, I was calling them stressors, but you create situations in which people get really desperate, really freaked out, and they act crazy. And I don't know, to be perfectly honest, I don't know how crazy it'll seem after a while. So, yeah, we got to do something about that, that's for sure.
Just what our previous speaker was saying about disruptors, to amplify that a little, is the social effects that you're referring to. A lot of it is the pace and the scope of the change. Maybe things will slow down a little if people, I sort of sense this around the world, certainly in this country, pulling away from globalization, pulling back regionally to say, we've got to think about this area. It hasn't worked for us to go forward this quickly or be too dependent on resources from a place that now is run by a despot or any number of things that are unpredictable and go wrong. Even after World War II, women didn't simply leave those jobs. They were given a good push. They were already married, many of them. And when the husbands returned, the idea was get out, give it back to him. He's home now, and you can go back to your place. This put a lot of stress on people who decided they did like those jobs. They did get a sense of satisfaction, and they wanted to keep them up. Simply returning home didn't suit everybody. And I think many of the men coming back from war, PTSD was not a diagnosis at the time. There was less understanding, and it was pretty much a woman's role to be there for her husband. If he had problems beyond her control, well, that was unfortunate. She would have to deal with it. And I think many of the daughters of these women, later around early 70s, you saw a real uprising of women. Many flooded into professions like law and doctors. Marriage at that point, for that succeeding generation, marriage now has changed permanently, it would seem, from what it was. 50% of marriages, certainly in this country, end within the first 5 years, just like small businesses. Almost 50% of families in this country are headed by single women. Imagine a pandemic where you're told, stay home, start schooling your kids. How are you going to survive?
No.
If you had a 5-year marriage, that man isn't under any legal obligation to help support you, especially if he's out of work.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, when you look at that book, The Technology Trap, that I referenced in the presentation, there's a great deal spent on that, especially because so many of these jobs, like in the auto industry, for example, that were made redundant by robotics, it was a lot of men being laid off and let go, and I don't know if it was pride. I don't know if it had to do with just old patriarchal ideas, but a lot of them didn't want to enter service jobs. And so you have this growing glut of men who are staying home, playing video games, not marrying, not working. This is where you see higher rates of substance abuse. And I think there's a fair and there's a strong correlation between that and phenomenons like QAnon, for example, and you know what we saw back on January 6th. So yeah, that's a big part of this too. And moving forward, I don't know the extent to which that will or won't continue, but you're absolutely right.
So the last thing that's coming to my mind is a question, which is, what's it all for? You know, the industrial revolutions and the progress that we've made technologically, industrially, productivity-wise, what's it all for? Well, it's for money. And in other words, the breakthroughs that increase productivity translate to increases in wealth, and the wealth is getting increasingly concentrated and flowing more and more to the uber wealthy. And that's what it's for, unfortunately, the trends. And is that really what we want? Is it for the good? So the technology trap, my father used to talk about the activity trap, you know, people confusing activity with progress. You know, just because you're busy doesn't mean you're doing anything. And the progress trap, in other words, this relentless pursuit of making advances, is it really improving lives? There are statistics, you know, that you know, global poverty is decreasing and so forth. But if you look at the United States and the percentage of Americans who are impoverished, is that decreasing at the same rate that it was, or is that leveled off? The number of people who cannot afford health care, the life expectancy, you know, how much, and that is now dropping in the United States. And yes, the pandemic is responsible for a recent tip there, but there are a lot of people who are inherently unhealthy. This is the only country on earth, I heard this, I mean, it's a great one-liner. You know, we're unique among nations where we have lots of people who are both obese and malnourished at the same time.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. Yeah. So, you know, what's it all for? I mean, we've got to figure out a way to bend the progress in the direction of benefiting everybody.
So, one of the authors I read before doing this podcast that really was sort of inspiring me to go in this direction was Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote the books *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*. I always recommend, if you want to, it's like, start with, you know, I'm not saying don't take it all with a little grain of salt, but fascinating writer. I highly recommend those two books, especially *Sapiens*. And he points to myths as being necessary for social cooperation, in particular the myths of, religious myths, obviously, great motivator a lot of the time, but also force of law, power, et cetera, and money. Money is a myth. I mean, what is a dollar bill? It's a piece of paper. It has no value other than we've all agreed it has some value. And it's incredibly motivating for the purposes of achieving social cooperation, nonetheless. And that has allowed us to build everything we're seeing around us right now, from the electric lights to the TV screen, the microphone, the iPad I read my speech on, even the canoe up there. Everything has been made possible thanks to the motivation of profit, like you said. But there is the question of, well, does material improvement mean life satisfaction improvement? And the answer is sort of yes and no, because certainly we are better off materially than we used to be, but are we better off spiritually? Are we better off in all these other ways that are actually important to the human experience as well? Maybe not as much. Maybe we can get that easier if we have access to, media that can give us some of these things a little faster, whether it be a comedy movie or I don't know, like audio book of the Bible or something, whatever you want to fulfill yourself spiritually or psychologically. But so many of these material goods, I mean, it might be great to get, and we're all driven to obtain stuff or services at the very least. But the feeling of being drunk is great. If you're constantly chasing that feeling, though, we don't think of that as healthy, for good reason. And I think you can make a similar argument for, material prosperity. If you're constantly seeking what that gives you, certainly that's not necessarily healthy either, from a psychological perspective. Yeah. And yet, that is very much what we do.
What happened? What happened after the Luddites came in? The price of the cost of labor went way down. That was 200 years ago. What was the next? What then happened? I mean, England did not fall apart. The masses did not revolt en masse.
It's a long story. The remainder of the decade had a few more outbreaks of violence. There is a story that I initially had in this presentation that I took out, or a couple of stories actually. For example, 1817, you have something called the Pentridge Rising. This is where a former Luddite named Jeremiah Brandreth organized a small army of fellow weavers who were just, by this point, totally without jobs. And they were fooled by a government spy to march toward London for what they were told was going to be like an overthrowing of the powers that be. And nope, they were instead arrested by a regiment, the I think 15th Regiment of Light Dragoons, and they were, a number of them were captured, including Brandreth, and they were tried for high treason, found guilty, hung, drawn, and quartered. You had the case of the Peterloo Massacre just 2 years after that, in which something like 70,000 radical workers in Manchester marched to go to a rally, hear a speaker talk about bringing democracy, expanding the franchise to everyone, and dragoons came in, and so did an army regiment, and 15 people died in a stampede, and other people were getting hacked by sabers. It was pretty brutal stuff. Even into the 1820s, there were more problems yet, and it doesn't really start to improve until about the 1830s, and like I said, by the 1850s then, there has been enough growing in the demand for labor with new machines invented, new jobs being created, new labor-enhancing technologies, for example, that are making it so that they can absorb more of this workforce. But that's a long period of time. I mean, we're talking about a process that took something like 40 years, and if you really think about like when it starts to go downhill around 1790s and doesn't start getting better until the 1830s, I mean, that's a generation, that's somebody's entire working life. And we're seeing something very similar where 50 years ago, people didn't necessarily expect the divergence of wealth that we've had over the last half century. So, like I said, it's not that every historical trend lasts forever, but this is the trend we're in right now. So it's worrisome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.